The Churches of Christ present Speaking the Truth in Love, a program bringing you life's answers from the Word of God.
Welcome to our program. I'm Michael Forshey, the minister of the Nettleton Church of Christ in Jonesboro, Arkansas. We are glad you joined us, and this program is brought to you by the area Churches of Christ who are listed at the end of the program. Please visit or contact them if you have a Bible question. I heard a story the other day, and it was just so strange, I thought I'd share it with you to get us started. And it seems, and I'm not sure, you have to forgive me, I'm not sure how long ago this took place, but there was a company, that of Learjet, that was having a dispute with an independent contractor. And it seems that the dispute centered around that this individual company, this independent company, was selling that of replacement windshields for the aircraft, but they were selling them at some $10,000 less. So as you get into this dispute and read about it, that of Learjet decided that, $10,000 less per windshield, they were losing great profits. And they went back and they did some testing, and they came out and issued a warning that the windshields that were being sold for a lesser price were not chicken tested. Now, can you imagine that? This company that's you're trusting with an aircraft to keep you, safe, that they were testing the windshields with chicken. And I thought, at one point in time, and I still believe this even with sharing this story with you, I thought that as a preacher of the gospel that I had the greatest job in the world. But at least this one will take second place. And you see, it's required that you test a windshield in an airplane. And the procedure that it's tested by is they fire a chicken at 300 knots at the windshield, and this would then simulate a bird strike. Now, in case you're not up on 300 knots, that's about 345 miles per hour. But what they found is the other company was still selling the windshields for $10,000 cheaper, and it was not required that they be tested. But what a job. Can you think of that? A great job that all day long you take chicken and you shoot them out of a cannon at a windshield to try and prove the safety. As we think about this, there are many things that we hear, and people come up with things, and we think we've heard it all. And the lesson that we're going to be presenting to you, we're going to be taking the lesson from Daniel chapter 2. And within the book of Daniel, there are a great many images and things to keep track of. But as we look at Daniel 2, let me give you a few reminders just to catch you up. We deal with Daniel and his friends. And this is kind of a sidebar or side note that not only I'm hoping that we can take the information in from Daniel chapter 2, but this is a great example in the entire book of Daniel when you're looking at, and I believe it may find its home with us as well, that Daniel and his friends have been taken from their homes. You remember that with the Babylonian captivity, there were 3 deportations. Daniel and his friends, being young and wise and talented, were taken in the first deportation. And we find that they are going to find themselves in a world completely opposite of what they grew up in and they had been accustomed to. And with this change, we're going to get to see Daniel and his 3 friends as they stand out among others. And there are some great struggles that we have in our own lifetime that perhaps things have changed, the world has changed, maybe the environment that we are not in is not the same as it once was. So let us take some time and spend in this book of Daniel, and we can look at the lessons of how do we, as servants of God, how do we represent God in our life and in the world we live, even when the world around us may be hostile to all of the things we've just mentioned, of a God-fearing person in their midst. But Daniel and his friends will rise above, and we're going to look at in Daniel 2, that of the dream by King Nebuchadnezzar. And as I was going through these verses, it's quite interesting of what Daniel comes across. And I want to remind you, too, that sometimes we read these accounts and we look at them and we kind of, let them play out. But there was great pressure upon Daniel and the other quote-unquote wise men in Babylon, because what we're going to find is that King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and it was such a horrible, terrible dream that it robbed him of sleep, and he is going to ask that they tell him his dream. So get that. First, they have to tell him what the dream was, and secondly, tell him what the interpretation is. And he declares that if they are not able to, that he is going to put them to death. And when Daniel enters into the account in Daniel 2, we're going to find that they had already started that of massacring that of the wise men because they were unable to deliver the 2 requirements, to tell the king his dream and then to tell him the interpretation. So as we're going to notice, and if you have your Bibles, I recommend that you open them up or at least make notes as you're following along. But we will be in Daniel chapter 2. And there's quite a few verses, so we'll make our way through. We'll give you some of the introduction, verses 1 through 13. Much of what we've tried to summarize, we'll get to read through that. But let us begin. Now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came, and they stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give you the interpretation. We pause there after verse 4, and this would be the normal response. If someone was telling you, I had a dream, could you tell me what it means? Well, sure, tell me that dream first. But not so with the king. In verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. Verse 7, they answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. Sounds as if the king has at least noticed that he wants a truthful interpretation of the dream. And as we would understand and think about this, if someone tells you all the details of the dream, you can, for the most part, could make something up. And, oh, this is what that means. So King Nebuchadnezzar, the dream was so terrible, again, that he lost sleep. He's saying, in order to prove that you are honest and pure and truthful, and that I get the correct interpretation, tell me the dream, and then tell me the interpretation. In verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the little g gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. And of course, at this point, we're reminded Daniel and his companions, after the material found in chapter 1, they have been made part of the wise men. And so we see here in verse 13, as the decree went out and they began killing the wise men, they sought Daniel and his companions to kill him. What we're going to notice is Daniel is going to receive this news, he and his 3 friends. And as we look at the 3 friends, we remember that their names were changed. They originally came with their Jewish names, if we can say that, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. But as they assimilated them into the Babylonian culture, they tried to erase that of portions of names that attach them to their and the one and true and only living God. So their names were changed. Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, and then we see that Hananiah was changed to Shadrach, Mishael was changed to Meshach, and Azariah to Abednego. So we're looking at these men who have now, through a test of character, a test of wills, remember they refused to eat and drink what others had been eating, have been added to the wise men. So when we read that the king has sent them out to kill the wise men, Daniel and his 3 friends are now part of that group. Picking up in verse 14, we're going to see that they are also going to be given the same challenge, but again, to stay alive, you must give the king his dream and then the interpretation. Beginning in verse 14, then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. So Daniel is going out, lack of a better word, out on a limb. So Daniel is asking for the opportunity, the time. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they may seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning the secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. We're going to have to at least pause for a moment, because Daniel and his 3 friends, great characters to study, and also examples for all of us, that even though Daniel and his friends had been promoted, they did not forget or leave God at home, as we would say. Didn't leave God out of their lives. But as this great challenge was presented to them, Daniel and his 3 friends entered into prayer and asked God for his assistance. We see then that they praise and thank God for that information. But now Daniel is going to go before the king and tell the matter, tell that of the dream. Beginning in verse 24, therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king, and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah, who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. And I love this verse 28, because Daniel doesn't say, hey, king, I got it. Daniel, as a humble servant of God, does not take credit, does not try to give the impression, hey, we're better than the rest of you Babylonians, we got the answer. But in verse 28, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the vision of your head upon your bed were these. So now he's going to start and reveal what the dream was. And I'm still fascinated by this. The dreams that even, we think of, and, maybe we awake in the morning and we think, well, I had dreams, but I can't remember any of them. But to have someone with the power and authority, such as King Nebuchadnezzar, to come and say, here's what I want. I want you to tell me my dream and then tell me the interpretation. So we begin, and as Daniel has given all credit to God, we're going to notice that he starts to reveal what the king saw. He says, as for you, O king, reminding us of verse 29, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this, and he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes, who made known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, where the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, and I want you to circle this verse. We've been reading all of these words, but the lesson's entitled The Stone, and Daniel's already mentioned it. But in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. Now, before we finish up the last few verses showing that of Daniel and his three friends, their lives being spared and them being promoted, we're going to see the name change, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want to talk to you about this stone, because when we're reading through all of this, yes, to look at this imagery. And there are some times that you can purchase materials, you can find it on the internet, and people have wove great and terrible stories from all of this. But what I want to just remind us of, when we're taking what Daniel is interpreting, we're talking about God giving us really a history lesson. And he's talking about that of the Babylonian kingdom, which they're well aware of as they've been taken captive by Babylon. And then we're going to look at the next empire, that of the Medo-Persians. And we're going to look at the progression. And then we come to that of the Greek empire, which, as you look at that, a very fast, very powerful, dominating kingdom. But then that last kingdom, that of iron, and then the feet of the iron and clay, showing that as the kingdom spread out, that it had strength and weakness. That's what we want to center upon, because what we're looking at here is a prophecy of the church. We're not talking about the little building in your neighborhood that you give directions, go down to the church and take a right. But we're talking about that of the universal appeal and that of the kingdom, as the names, those words are used interchangeably. So as we're taking a look at this, again, Daniel was not just giving a history lesson. He was not trying to say, hey, I need to come up with a really great story here to save my life, my friends. And Daniel actually is looking at preserving all the lives of the wise men, as they're all under that of the order of execution. But let's just take a moment and let's talk about a few things that we need to at least be mindful of. There are at least 4 things that Daniel brings out here when he describes that stone. And the beauty of this is many people wrestle back and forth wondering, was there any prophecies demonstrating of when, as Jesus said in Matthew 16:18, he would build his church? Is there any way we can say when this actually took place? And I want you to notice that it had to take place, just as Daniel said. Remember, God gave him the interpretation. Daniel didn't make this up. He praised God for what God had told him. But during the days of the Roman Empire is when we see Jesus fulfilling his promise to build the church. This is important to us as we talk about the one true church. I want you to notice there are at least 4 things. First, when Daniel is told, thou sawest, or is telling the king, thou sawest that a stone was cut out without hands. The kingdom, the church, did not originate with man. It was not man's doing to say, let's put together this religious group. The kingdom shall also not be left to other people. It would be different in nature. When Daniel was giving the image in the interpretation, we see the kingdom as it went from one power to the next. The second thing, the kingdom is actually described here as being very aggressive. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. That's us as Christians going out into the world and preaching. Third, the kingdom is universal in nature, and the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. That of the tremendous growth, very similar to the mustard seed growing into a tree. And the fourth, the indestructible nature of the kingdom. Now, this doesn't mean that a congregation may not grow and or decrease in numbers, but the church that Jesus died for, that he purchased with his own blood, the one and only church, that of his body, which he is the head of, is indestructible. In Daniel 2, verse 44, he says, it shall stand forever. Prior to the birth of Jesus, in Luke 1, verse 30 through 33, we see that Mary is told, and the angel announced that of the kingdom, and that there would be no end to the kingdom of Christ. In the book of Hebrews, in chapter 12 and verse 28, we speak about, and those of the brethren that are addressed in the epistle to the Hebrews, we're told that they were members of a kingdom which cannot be moved. What's interesting also is if you go back and you look at Hebrews 1 and verse 1, they were also, as we talk about the latter times, the last days, they were living in those. And the Hebrew writer also says not only were they members of the kingdom which cannot be moved, but they were also members of the church of the firstborn, putting those two together, the kingdom and the church. So we are not awaiting some special time in the future and God suddenly going to fulfill his promises he made while Jesus was both living on the earth and since that time. But Daniel outlines in history that during the days of the Roman kings, and so we're looking at somewhere 60 BC up to 400 and some odd numbers of AD of when the Roman Empire was in power and in control. And Daniel said it was then, during the days of those kings, the Roman Empire. Now, you can do fancy things and somersaults and all of the different spiritual gymnastics and try and spread some toes out and try and expand all of this. But what we're going to notice is we have it here. And I'd like to invite you to come and study with us, and then also to become a member of the Lord's church through that of your obedience to the gospel. If we can help you out in any way, please let us know and contact a local congregation, one that is near you. I thank you for your time.
If you have a Bible question, would like to receive a free Bible correspondence course, would like a copy of 2 free books, please contact the Nettleton Church of Christ. Speaking the Truth in Love is brought to you by these area churches of Christ. Speaking the Truth in Love can be viewed online at nettletonchurchofchrist.org.